They called them the Mad Orphans of Blackwater Ridge. In the autumn of 1886, while every other homesteader in the Montana Territory was busy reinforcing their roofs and stacking firewood against their cabin walls, exactly as their fathers and grandfathers had done for generations, two children on the mountainside were doing something that made no sense to anyone who rode past. Elspeth Whitmore was 17 years old, and her brother Thaddeus, whom she called Tad, was 14. They had no parents. They had no aunts or uncles or cousins to take them in. They had a falling down cabin on a rocky piece of land that nobody else wanted, a border collie named Odin who was too old to herd anything anymore, and a leather-bound journal filled with drawings that their dead grandfather had left behind. And on that October morning, with the aspens turning gold and the first whispers of winter sharpening the air, the two of them were outside building what looked like a giant canvas snake stretching from their front door all the way to their woodshed. The structure was 47 feet long, 5 feet high at its peak, and 4 feet wide. It was made of salvaged canvas from their grandfather's old mining tents, stretched over curved poles of Douglas fir that Tad had bent using steam and patience and bleeding fingers. The whole thing hugged the ground like a tunnel, like a fabric caterpillar frozen in mid-crawl across the frozen mud of their yard. It was, by any reasonable measure, the strangest thing anyone in Elk Ridge had ever seen. Elspeth worked in silence, her calloused hands pulling the ropes tight while her breath came out in the small white clouds. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and there was a smudge of dirt across her left cheek that she had not bothered to wipe away. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had learned long ago that explaining herself to people who had already decided she was foolish was a waste of breath she could not afford. Beside her, Tad consulted the journal for the 100th time, his finger tracing the faded pencil lines of their grandfather's drawings. He was slight for his age, with the kind of pale, serious face that made strangers assume he was sickly. He was not sickly. He was simply someone who lived more in his mind than in his body, someone who saw the world as a series of problems waiting to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. Their grandfather Magnus had been the same way. Magnus Whitmore had come to America from Norway in 1859, a young man with strong hands and a head full of knowledge that his own father had passed down to him. He had worked the silver mines in Colorado, then the copper mines in Montana, and finally he had claimed this piece of rocky land on Blackwater Ridge because it had a spring that never froze and a southern exposure that caught the winter sun. He had been a good man, a quiet man, a man who knew things about surviving cold that the American-born settlers around him had never needed to learn. He had taken in his two grandchildren after their parents died of typhoid fever in 1882, and he had raised them with the same patience and care that he brought to everything he did. And in the winter of 1885, just 18 months ago, he had died. Elspeth still remembered that January morning with perfect, terrible clarity. The sound of the door opening, the blast of frozen air, her grandfather's voice saying he was just going out to fetch more firewood for the children, that the fire was getting low and he did not want them to be cold. The blizzard had come on suddenly, the way Montana blizzards did. By the time Magnus reached the woodshed 30 feet from the cabin door, the snow was falling so thick.
What in God's name is this supposed to be?
It's a thermal buffer, a transition passage. It's designed to keep the firewood dry.
Thick and fast that he could not see his hand in front of his face. He had gotten lost, 30 feet from safety, and he had gotten lost. They found his body when the spring thaw came, curled up against a tree not 50 yards from home, frozen solid with his arms wrapped around his chest. The doctor said he would not have suffered long. The cold took you quick once you stopped moving. You just fell asleep and never woke up. Elspeth had not cried at the funeral. She had stood beside her brother in the little cemetery on the hill, and she had watched them lower her grandfather into the frozen ground, and she had made herself a promise that she would never let the winter take anyone she loved ever again. She just had not known how to keep that promise until Tad found the journal. It had been hidden under a loose floorboard in their grandfather's room, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Inside were years of notes written in Magnus's careful hand, some in English and some in Norwegian, along with dozens of detailed drawings, instructions for building things, techniques for surviving things, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Norwegians who had learned to live in a cold that would kill most men. And on page 47, there was a drawing of a tunnel. Their grandfather had labeled it in Norwegian first, then translated below. Overgangsgang, transition passage. A covered walkway made of canvas and wood, designed to connect a dwelling to its fuel storage. Below the drawing, Magnus had written, "The true enemy of winter is not the cold itself, it is the moisture that turns firewood into useless blocks of ice." This tunnel creates a thermal buffer, a space that is neither inside nor outside, where the air remains dry and the wood remains burnable. I saw the Sami people use this technique in the far north of Norway. My father used it. His father used it before him. I will build one here before the next bad winter comes. He had never gotten the chance, but now his grandchildren would build it for him. Odin lay nearby on a patch of dry ground, watching them work with the patient attention of an old dog who had seen many things and was prepared to see many more. He was 8 years old now, gray around his muzzle, slower than he used to be. His hips ached when the weather changed, and he could no longer run the way he had when he was young. But his eyes were still sharp, and his loyalty was still absolute. He had been Magnus's dog first, trained to understand commands in Norwegian, and after Magnus died, he had transferred his devotion to the children without hesitation. He did not understand what they were building, but he understood that they were building something important, and that was enough. The sound of hoofbeats made Elspeth look up. 5 riders were coming up the trail from town, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. She recognized Josiah Blackwood at the front. His broad shoulders and silver-streaked beard been unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him rode Dr. Edmund Holloway, Franklin Briggs, and 2 other men from the town council. Elspeth's hands tightened on the rope she was holding. Josiah Blackwood owned the general store in Elk Ridge. He was 55 years old, prosperous, respected, and he had been trying to get Elspeth and Tad sent to the orphanage in Helena ever since Magnus died. Not out of cruelty, he always said, out of concern, out of Christian charity. 2 children could not survive alone on that worthless piece of land, and it was the town's responsibility to see them properly cared for. What he did not say, but what everyone knew, was that Franklin Briggs wanted to buy the Whitmore claim for its spring. Fresh water was worth more than gold in these parts, and the spring on Blackwater Ridge was the best one for 20 miles. The riders stopped at the edge of the yard. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Josiah Blackwood sat on his horse and stared at the canvas tunnel with an expression that moved slowly from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like pity. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has seen something so absurd that he cannot help himself. The laugh of someone who genuinely believes he is witnessing folly of the highest order. The other men joined in, even Dr. Holloway, who was 48 years old and prided himself on his Philadelphia education and his scientific mind, allowed
Round things last.
You knew our grandfather?
I saw something like this once when I was a boy in the mines.
Don't let the fools
himself a chuckle. Josiah swung down from his horse and walked closer, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. He circled the tunnel slowly, reaching out to touch the canvas, to test the tension of the ropes, to examine the joints where the poles came together. Finally, he turned to face the children. What in God's name is this supposed to be? Elspeth said nothing. She simply continued pulling the rope tight, her eyes fixed on her work. Tad stepped forward, the journal clutched to his chest. It's a thermal buffer, he said, a transition passage. It's designed to keep the firewood dry during blizzards by creating an intermediate temperature zone that prevents the freeze-thaw cycle that destroys fuel supplies. Josiah's eyebrows rose. A thermal buffer. The canvas creates an air gap that prevents moisture from sun. Josiah held up a hand, and his voice was kind, the way adults are kind when they were about to explain something obvious to a child who does not understand. I've lived in Montana for 40 years. I've survived more winters than you've had birthdays. And I have never in all my life seen anybody build a canvas tent between their house and their woodpile. It's not a tent, it's a tunnel. If you look at the design in the journal, your grandfather was a good man, Josiah said. and now his voice was gentle, almost sad. A hard worker, a decent neighbor, but he was also a foreigner who never quite understood how we do things here. Stacking wood against the house under the eaves has worked for every settler in this territory since the first one arrived. It worked for my father. It works for me. It will work for you too, if you have any sense. Franklin Briggs dismounted and walked over to join them. He was 45 years old, a lean man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. His ranch was the largest in the valley, and he had made no secret of his desire to expand it further. Josiah's right, Franklin said. This is a waste of good canvas that could be patching your roof, a waste of timber that could be reinforcing your walls, a waste of time that could be spent doing actual work. He paused and his smile widened slightly. Of course, if you children are finding it too difficult to maintain this property on your own, I would be happy to take it off your hands. I could offer you a fair price, and you could use the money to start fresh somewhere more suitable. The orphanage in Helena is quite well regarded, I understand. Elspeth's jaw tightened, but she still did not speak. Dr. Holloway had dismounted as well and was examining the structure with the air of a scientist studying a curiosity. He walked the length of the tunnel, peering at the construction, testing the stability of the poles. The craftsmanship is actually quite clever, he admitted. The curved poles distribute stress well, and the canvas appears to be properly waterproofed. Young Thaddeus clearly has some aptitude for engineering. He straightened up and shook his head. But the fundamental concept is flawed. Canvas cannot withstand sustained wind loads of the magnitude we see in Montana winters. The first real storm will tear this thing to pieces. It's structurally impractical. And even if it holds, Josiah added, what's the point? The woodpile doesn't need a covered walkway. You just put on your coat and you go get the wood. That's what everyone does. That's what everyone has always done. Tad opened his mouth to argue, but Elspeth finally spoke. You will see. Her voice was quiet, but something in it made all 5 men turn to look at her. She had stopped working and was standing very still, her dark eyes meeting Josiah's without flinching. My grandfather survived winters in Norway that would kill everyone in this town, she said. He survived them because his father taught him things that your fathers never knew. He did not draw this tunnel because he was foolish. He drew it because he understood something about cold and moisture and survival that you do not understand. And when the real winter comes, you will see that he was right. The silence stretched out for a long moment. Then Josiah shook his head slowly, almost sadly. He looked at the other men, and there was something like pity in his eyes. Those orphans are building their own graves, he said, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. The other men followed, and their laughter echoed off the mountainside long after they had disappeared from view. After they were gone, Tad let out a breath he had been holding. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. Elsie, maybe we should explain better. If Dr. Holloway understood the science, people who have already decided you are foolish do not listen to explanations. Elspeth picked up her rope and went back to work. They listened to results, so we will give them results. Odin rose stiffly from his spot and walked over to Elspeth, pressing his gray muzzle against her hand. She paused long enough to scratch behind his ears, feeling the old dog lean into her touch. Bestefar would be proud of us, Tad said quietly, using the Norwegian word for grandfather that Magnus had taught them. Bestefar would tell us to stop talking and finish the tunnel before the first snow. Tad smiled just a little and picked up his own rope. They worked until the sun went down, and then they worked by lantern light for another hour after that. When they finally went inside, their hands were raw and their muscles ached, but another section of the tunnel was complete. That night, word of what the Whitmore orphans were building spread through Elk Ridge like wildfire. By morning, everyone in town would be laughing. If you believe that knowledge passed down through generations has real value, hit that like button now. Let us see who survives the winter. The laughter started at the general store and spread outward like ripples in a pond. Josiah Blackwood told the story to everyone who came in to buy some.
Bestefar always said kindness is not for those who deserve it. It's what defines who you are.
Come in.
Complies, embellishing it a little more each time. The orphan children had gone mad with grief, he said. They were building a giant fabric worm across their property. They thought a tent would protect them from Montana winters. They had inherited their grandfather's foreign foolishness along with his worthless land. By the end of the first week, people were riding up to Blackwater Ridge just to see the spectacle for themselves. Cordelia Ashford came on Tuesday, bringing 3 other women from the church auxiliary. She was 50 years old, the wife of the wealthiest merchant in Elk Ridge, and she considered herself an authority on what was proper and what was not. She stood at the edge of the Whitmore property with her hands folded in front of her and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Poor things," she said, loud enough for Elspeth to hear. "No parents to teach them sense, no adults to guide them. Is it any wonder they've turned to such foolishness?" Her companions murmured in agreement. "Someone really ought to do something," one of them said. "It's cruel to let them waste their time like this when they could be learning useful skills. It's cruel to let them freeze to death because of their own stubbornness," Cordelia replied. "But what can we do? The girl has her grandfather's pride. She won't listen to anyone who tries to help her." They stayed for nearly an hour, watching and whispering, before finally riding back to town to spread the story further. On Wednesday, Rufus Tanner came. Rufus was 22 years old, the son of a rancher, and he had a reputation for being the loudest voice at every gathering and the first to propose any bet. He rode up with 6 friends, all of them young men with too much time and too little sense, and he stood in front of the half-finished tunnel with his hands on his hips and a grin splitting his face. "Boys," he announced, "I will bet $5 that this contraption collapses by Christmas. Who wants a piece of that action?" His friends immediately began placing their own bets. The consensus was that the tunnel would not last until the first real snow. One optimistic soul gave it until Thanksgiving. Nobody bet that it would survive the winter. Rufus walked over to where Tad was working on a joint, bending down to examine it with exaggerated interest. "Tell me something, boy," he said. "When this thing falls down and crushes you, do you want us to bury you underneath it, or should we pull your body out first?" Tad's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Odin was there. The old dog had risen from his spot by the door and positioned himself between Tad and Rufus, his gray head lowered, a soft growl building in his throat. Rufus stepped back, his grin faltering slightly. "Easy, dog." Odin did not move, did not blink, just stood there, gray and old and absolutely unwilling to let anyone threaten his boy. Rufus laughed, but it was not quite as confident as before. "Fine, fine, keep your mutt, but don't say I didn't warn you when January comes and you're digging through a pile of frozen canvas looking for your firewood." He mounted his horse and rode away, his friends following, their laughter echoing off the mountainside. On Thursday, Reverend Silas Thornton came. The Reverend was 60 years old, with a long face and somber eyes, and a voice that could fill a church without ever rising above a conversational tone. He was respected in Elk Ridge, looked to for guidance on matters both spiritual and practical. He did not laugh at the tunnel. He studied it with a frown of concern, his hands clasped behind his back. "Children," he said finally, "I worry about you. I worry about your souls." Tad looked up from his work. "Our souls, Reverend? This knowledge you speak of, this technique from the old country, the Sami people your grandfather mentioned in his journal." Thornton's frown deepened. These were pagan peoples, children. They worshipped spirits and nature gods. The wisdom they passed down was not wisdom from the Lord. "It's just a tunnel," Elspeth said flatly. "It's just canvas and wood and rope. Nothing is ever just anything." Thornton stepped closer, his voice dropping. "The Lord helps those who follow proven ways, not heathen experiments. I urge you to abandon this project and put your faith in prayer and in the methods that have sustained Christian settlers in this territory for generations." Elspeth looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said. "We will take it under consideration." But she did not stop working, and when Thornton rode away, shaking his head sadly, she and Tad exchanged a look that needed no words. They would finish the tunnel, no matter what anyone said. The construction took 6 weeks. Not because it was complicated. Magnus's designs were clear and detailed, and Tad had inherited his grandfather's ability to read blueprints and translate them into reality. The tunnel was not a difficult thing to build, not conceptually, but everything was difficult when you were 17 years old and 14 years old and had no one to help you. The first week was the hardest. They had to cut and shape the poles, bending them into the proper curves using a steam box that Tad built from an old barrel and a length of pipe. The process was slow and exhausting. The wood had to be heated for hours before it would bend, and even then, it sometimes cracked and split and had to be discarded. By the end of that first week, Elspeth's hands were so blistered that she had to wrap them in strips of cloth just to hold the tools. But she did not stop. She soaked the cloth in cold water from the spring, and she kept working because stopping was not an option. The second week brought rain. 3 days of cold, steady rain that turned the yard into a sea of mud and made every task twice as difficult. The canvas they had laid out to cut and sew became soaked and heavy, impossible to work with until it dried. The holes they had dug for the poles filled with water and had to be bailed out by hand. Tad slipped in the mud on the fourth day and fell from the ladder he was using to reach the top of a pole. He landed hard on his side, and for a terrible moment Elspeth thought he had broken something. But he got up slowly, clutching his ribs, his face white with pain, and he refused to go inside. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Just bruised. Keep working." She made him rest for one day, just one. And then they were back at it, because the calendar did not care about bruised ribs, and winter was coming whether they were ready or not. The third week they ran out of rope. The tunnel required a precise amount of tension to function properly, and the old rope they had salvaged from their grandfather's supplies was not enough. They needed to buy more, which meant riding into town, which meant facing the stares and whispers of everyone they passed. Elspeth went alone. She walked into Josiah Blackwood's general store with her head held high and her money in her hand, and she asked for—
"Can I pet the dog?" "He's been waiting for you."
for 50 feet of good hemp rope. Josiah sold it to her without comment, but she could feel his eyes on her back as she left, and she could hear the whispers that started before the door had even closed behind her. The fourth week, the first frost came. The ground hardened, which made it easier to walk but harder to drive stakes. Every hole had to be chopped into the frozen earth with a pickaxe, and every stake had to be hammered in with a force that left Elspeth's arms aching. But the frost also brought something else. It brought urgency. The white coating on the grass in the mornings, the ice that formed on the water bucket overnight, the way the air bit at exposed skin with teeth that would only grow sharper as the weeks went on. Winter was no longer a distant threat. Winter was coming. Winter was here. The fifth week, Tad fell again. This time it was worse. He was on the ladder securing a joint near the top of a pole, and his foot slipped on a rung that had become slick with frost. He fell 8 feet and landed on his back, and he did not get up. Elspeth ran to him, her heart in her throat, and for a terrible moment she thought he was dead. But then he gasped, the breath rushing back into his lungs, and his eyes opened, and he looked up at her with an expression of pure frustration. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, Elsie. I should have been more careful." She helped him up, her hands shaking. His ribs were bruised again, worse than before, and this time she made him stay inside for 3 days. 3 days that she worked alone, in the cold, while her brother watched through the window with guilt written across his face. But she did not blame him. How could she? He was 14 years old, doing the work of grown men, and he had not complained once. He had not asked to rest, had not asked for help, had not asked for anything except the chance to finish what their grandfather had started. The 6th week, they ran out of canvas. The tunnel was almost complete, just 12 feet short of the woodshed, and they did not have enough material to finish it. The remaining canvas in their supplies was too rotted to use, too full of holes to hold together. For a moment, standing in the yard in the gray November light, Elspeth felt despair wash over her. They had come so far. They had worked so hard, and now, with the end in sight, they were going to fail. But then Tad spoke. "The tent," he said, "grandfather's old tent, the one he used when he was prospecting." Elspeth stared at him. That tent is 40 years old. It's been sitting in the shed since before we were born. It's canvas. It might still be good. They found the tent buried under a pile of old equipment in the corner of the shed. It was dusty and stained and smelled of mildew. But when they unfolded it and held it up to the light, there were no holes, no rot. The canvas was thick and heavy and still waterproof. It was enough. On November 15th, 1886, after 6 weeks of labor, the tunnel was finished. Elspeth stood at the entrance and looked down its length, at the way the light filtered through the canvas and turned everything golden, at the dry ground beneath her feet, at the quiet stillness of the air inside. From the outside, it looked strange, a fabric passage crawling across the yard, a monument to foolishness if you listened to the people in town. But from the inside, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like safety. It felt like warmth. It felt like her grandfather's arms around her one last time. Tad joined her, and together they walked the length of the tunnel to the woodshed. Their footsteps made soft sounds on the packed earth. The wind was blowing outside. They could hear it whistling past. But inside the tunnel, the air was still and dry and calm. The woodshed was stacked full of firewood that Elspeth had cut and split over the summer. Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, dried and seasoned and ready to burn. She reached out and touched the nearest log. It was dry, perfectly dry. No frost, no ice, no frozen moisture. "It works," Tad said, and his voice held a note of wonder. "Elsie, it actually works." "Of course it works." Elspeth allowed herself a small smile. Bestafar knew what he was doing. They walked back through the tunnel together, Odin padding along behind them on his old legs. When they emerged into the open air, the cold hit them like a slap, a reminder of what waited outside the canvas walls. The first test came 3 days later. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and a heavy frost coated everything in the valley with white. The neighbors who had stacked their wood against their cabin walls, trusting the eaves to protect it, woke to find their woodpiles dusted with frost. Not frozen, not yet, but frosted. The beginning of the cycle that Magnus's journal had warned about. At the Whitmore cabin, the wood remained dry. Elspeth walked through the tunnel in a light sweater, comfortable as if it were a spring day. She collected an armful of wood, carried it back to the cabin, and fed the fire without ever having to put on her heavy coat, without ever having to face the killing cold. Word of this got back to town, of course. Everything got back to town in a place like Elk Ridge. But the skeptics were not impressed. "Wait for the real cold," Dr. Holloway told everyone at the general store. "That contraption cannot survive a true Montana blizzard. The wind loads alone will tear it apart." Rufus Tanner raised his bet to $10. And high above the town, on the ridge where the wind blew coldest, the tunnel stood waiting for the storm that everyone knew was coming. They were not entirely alone during those weeks. On the third week of construction, a man appeared at the edge of their property. He was 78 years old, with a face like weathered leather and hands that shook slightly with age. He walked with a cane carved from mountain ash, and he stood for a long time watching the children work before he finally spoke. "Round things last." Elspeth and Tad both turned to look at him. "My name is Garrett Morrison," the old man said. "Folks call me Old Garrett. I've lived in this territory for 53 years. Before that, I lived in Cornwall, in England. Mining country, cold country. Not as cold as here, but cold enough." He walked closer, examining the tunnel with eyes that were still sharp despite his age. "I saw something like this once, when I was a boy. A covered way between the shaft head and the engine house, to keep the equipment dry. Curved walls, just like this. Because round things last. Square things break." He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather knew that." Elspeth felt something ease in her chest, something she had not even realized was tight. "You knew our grandfather?" "I knew of him, knew his reputation as a man who understood the old ways. Never had the pleasure of meeting him properly, and now I regret that." Old Garrett turned to face her, and his eyes were kind. "He was a clever man, and I suspect you are clever too. Don't let the fools discourage you, girl. The fools always laugh until they stop laughing." After that, Old Garrett came by every few days, bringing food that his daughter-in-law had made, offering advice when asked, simply sitting and watching when he had nothing to say. His presence was a comfort, a reminder that not everyone in the world thought they were mad. A week later, another visitor arrived. Ingrid Lindqvist was 35 years old, a widow who had come to Montana from Sweden with her husband 5 years ago. Her husband had died of pneumonia the previous winter, leaving her alone on a small farm at the edge of town. She had the pale eyes and strong features of her homeland, and when she saw the tunnel, she stopped in her tracks and stared. Övergångspassage, she said softly, using the Swedish word. Tad looked up. You know what this is? In Sweden, we called it a transition passage. My grandmother had one at her farm near Kiruna, in the far north, where the winter darkness lasted for months. Ingrid walked closer, touching the canvas with something like reverence. I have not seen one since I left home. I thought I would never see one again. She turned to face the children, and her eyes were bright with emotion. You are building something good here. Something real. Something from the old country that the people here have forgotten, or maybe never knew. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. After that, Ingrid came too, bringing bread and cheese and sometimes jars of preserves. She did not help with the physical work, being a small woman.
We were wrong. Your grandfather's tunnel saved my grandson's life.
I just followed his instructions.
No, that faith is worth more than anything I've ever owned.
Who had never been strong, but she helped in other ways. She told stories of the old country while they worked, stories of winters that lasted 8 months, and of the ways people had learned to survive them. She made them feel connected to something larger than themselves, to a chain of knowledge that stretched back through generations. And then there was Ephraim. Ephraim Morrison was old Garrett's grandson, 16 years old, with his grandfather's sharp eyes and his generation's restless energy. He had heard the stories about the mad orphans and their ridiculous tunnel, and he had come up to the ridge expecting to find something to laugh at. Instead, he found himself fascinated. He asked questions, he studied the journal, he helped Tad calculate angles and measure distances, and by the end of his first visit, he was no longer laughing. Can you teach me? He asked Tad. Not just how to build this, but how to understand the principles behind it. The thermal buffer, the air gap, all of it. Tad looked at Elspeth. She gave the smallest of nods. I can try, Tad said. Ephraim Morrison became their first student. December passed. The days grew shorter. The cold grew deeper. The tunnel stood firm against the wind and the frost and the weight of the early snows. And the sky began to change. Old Garrett Morrison was the first to notice. He had been watching the sky for more than 70 years, and he knew the signs better than any barometer or thermometer could tell him. The way the clouds moved, the color of the sunset, the feeling in his bones that had never been wrong, not once in all his years. He rode up to the Whitmore cabin on the morning of January 9th, 1887. His face was grave. Something is coming, he told Elspeth. Something bad. The worst I've ever felt. I don't know if it will be tomorrow or next week, but it is coming, and it is going to be like nothing any of us have ever seen. Elspeth looked at the sky. It was that flat, iron gray that her grandfather had always warned her about. The color of a sky that was holding something back. The color of a sky that was about to break. I know, she said. I can feel it too. That night, she checked the tunnel one last time, made sure every stake was secure, made sure every rope was tight, made sure the entrance flaps could be sealed from the inside if necessary. Odin followed her through the tunnel and back, his old legs moving stiffly, but his eyes still alert. When they returned to the cabin, he curled up by the fire and would not move, would not go outside for anything, not even to relieve himself. Just lay there, shivering slightly, pressing himself against the warm stones of the hearth, as if he could feel something approaching that humans could not quite sense. On the morning of January 10th, 1887, at 3:47 a.m., the world ended. The sound woke Elspeth from a dead sleep. It was not thunder, not wind, not any sound she had ever heard before. It was deeper than thunder, more constant, more alive, like the roar of a waterfall made of ice, like a freight train that stretched from horizon to horizon and would never, ever stop coming. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, pulling back the heavy curtain to look outside. She could see nothing, not because it was dark. The lantern on the porch was still burning. She could see its faint glow through the glass. But beyond that glow, there was only white. White above, white below, white in every direction. Snow falling so thick and fast that it swallowed the world, that erased everything, that turned the familiar landscape into a blank page of pure, killing cold. Tad appeared at her elbow, his face pale in the lamplight. Is it? Yes. Elspeth let the curtain fall. It's here. Do you think the tunnel will hold? Subscribe to the channel now because you will not want to miss what happens next. The blizzard that struck Montana on January 10, 1887, would later be called the worst in living memory. Newspapers across the country would write about it for months. Scientists would study it for years. Old-timers would talk about it for the rest of their lives, measuring every subsequent winter against the one that almost killed them all. The temperature, which had been 15 below zero when the storm began, dropped to 47 below by the following morning. The wind gusted to 65 miles per hour, driving the snow sideways with such force that it stripped bark from trees and cut exposed skin like tiny knives. In some places, the snow fell at a rate of 4 inches per hour, piling up in drifts 20 feet high against anything that stood in its way. For the people of Elk Ridge, the first day was merely uncomfortable. By the second day, it was becoming frightening. By the third day, it was a disaster. By the fourth day, people were beginning to die. The problem was not the cold itself. Cold could be endured if you had enough fuel to keep the fire burning. The problem was the wood. Every cabin in the valley had its wood pile stacked against the wall, under the eaves, exactly as generations of settlers had done before. This arrangement worked well enough in normal winters when the snow fell gently and the wind was mild and the temperature stayed above zero. But this was not a normal winter. The first night, snow drifted against the wood piles and covered them completely. The second day, the sun came out briefly around noon, warming the air just enough to melt the top layer of that snow into water. The second night, the temperature plunged again, and that melted snow refroze into a solid glaze of ice that sealed the wood piles like glass. And the third day, the real cold set in, and the glaze became armor. In the cabin of Josiah Blackwood, the most prosperous man in Elk Ridge, the fire began to die. Josiah had gone out that morning to fetch more wood, forcing his way through a drift that reached his waist. The wind was so strong that he had to lean into it just to stay on his feet. The snow was so thick that he could not see his own hand at arm's length. By the time he finally reached his woodpile, he was already half frozen, his fingers numb inside his gloves, his face raw from the driving ice. And when he got there, he found his woodpile transformed. What had been neat stacks of split logs was now a single frozen mass, the individual pieces welded together by ice so thick and so hard that his axe bounced off it like he was striking stone. He swung again and again, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his arms burning with exhaustion, and managed to chip free a single log. Just one. He spent an hour in the killing cold, hacking at the ice with everything he had, and managed to free exactly 3 logs. By the time he got back inside, his fingers were white with the beginning of frostbite, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and the logs he had worked so hard to retrieve were soaked through with frozen moisture. He fed them to the fire anyway. He had no choice. They hissed and popped and smoked, filling the cabin with acrid steam, but they would not burn hot. The fire that had kept his home at 65 degrees now struggled to keep it above 40. His wife wrapped the children in every blanket they owned and huddled them together in the center of the room, while Josiah stared at the smoking logs and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The same scene played out in cabin after cabin across the valley. Dr. Edmund Holloway discovered his woodpile frozen solid on the 3rd day. He understood the science of it better than Josiah did, understood that the heat escaping from their homes had melted the snow touching their woodpiles, that the cold had refrozen it, that the cycle had repeated over and over until the wood was not merely wet, but saturated with ice at a molecular level. Even if you could pry a log free, it would spend all its energy boiling off moisture instead of producing heat. You would have to burn 3 times as much wood just to maintain the same temperature. And they did not have 3 times as much wood. By the 4th day, people were burning their furniture. By the 5th day, people were tearing up their floorboards. By the 6th day, Franklin Briggs stood in his barn and counted the bodies of 47 cattle, frozen solid where they stood, because he had not been able to keep the building warm enough to save them. And by the 7th day, people were starting to die. High on Blackwater Ridge in the small cabin that everyone had pitied, Elspeth Whitmore opened her front door and stepped into the tunnel. The wind was screaming outside. She could hear it, could feel the vibration of it through the canvas walls. The whole structure was shaking, trembling, groaning under the assault of the storm. But it was holding. The curved walls deflected the wind instead of catching it. The stakes driven deep into the frozen ground kept it anchored. The design that everyone had laughed at was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And inside the tunnel, the air was still. Cold, yes, but a clean cold. A dry cold. Not the killing, wet cold that was destroying everyone else's firewood. She walked down the tunnel in her shirt sleeves, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, but no coat, no hat, no gloves. The temperature inside was 28 degrees, according to the thermometer Tad had hung near the entrance. Cold enough to preserve the wood, warm enough to prevent the deadly freeze-thaw cycle. At the woodshed, she selected the logs she needed. They were dry, perfectly, beautifully dry. No ice, no frost, no moisture of any kind. The tunnel had done exactly what her grandfather had designed it to do. It had created a buffer zone, a space that was cold enough to prevent the outward transfer of moisture from the cabin, but not warm enough to melt the snow and start the freezing cycle. She carried the logs back through the tunnel, fed them to the fire, and watched them catch instantly, burning clean and hot, filling the cabin with the kind of deep, penetrating warmth that dries the air and warms you to your bones. Tad was keeping records, because Tad always kept records. He had a notebook open on the table and he was writing down numbers in his careful hand. Outside temperature, -47 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature inside the tunnel, 28 degrees. Temperature inside the cabin, 62 degrees. Wood consumption, normal. Fire performance, optimal. He looked up at his sister, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite triumph. It was more like vindication, like relief, like the knowledge that their grandfather had not been a fool, that they had not been fools for believing in him. It's working, Elsie. It's really working. I know. Odin lay by the hearth, his old bones grateful for the warmth, his tail thumping gently whenever one of the children walked past. He was the only one who had never doubted the tunnel. He was the only one who had never needed proof. For the Whitmore orphans, the worst blizzard in living memory was simply weather. Dangerous weather, yes, weather to be respected, but not weather to be feared. Because they had prepared, because their grandfather had taught them, because they had built the tunnel that everyone laughed at. On the night of the 7th day, there was a pounding on the door. Elspeth was not asleep. She had not been able to sleep properly since the storm began, some instinct keeping her alert for trouble, even though no trouble had come to their door. She was sitting by the fire, mending a shirt by lamplight, when the sound came. A desperate, frantic pounding, like someone was trying to beat the door down with their frozen fists. She rose and walked to the door, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She opened it. Josiah Blackwood stood on the porch, his face gray with cold, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes wild with a desperation she had never seen in him before. Frost clung to his beard, ice crusted his eyebrows. His hands, when he reached toward her, were shaking so badly that he could barely control them. Behind him, barely visible in the swirling snow, were 4 other figures. His wife clutching her shawl around her shoulders. His son, a man of 30, holding his own wife upright. And a small child, no more than 4 years old, wrapped in so many blankets that he looked like a bundle of fabric, with a pale, terrified face peering out. The child was coughing, not a normal cough, a deep, racking, terrible cough that shook his entire body and left him gasping for breath. The kind of cough that came from breathing too much smoke from wet wood in a closed room. The kind of cough that could kill. Josiah opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply stood there, the man who had called them mad orphans, the man who had led the effort to send them to the orphanage, the man who had laughed loudest at their foolish tunnel. He stood there with his dying grandson in his arms, and he could not find the words to ask for help. Elspeth looked at the child more closely. The cough was not from cold. She had heard that sound before, in the stories her grandfather had told about the mining camps where he had worked. It was the cough of someone who had breathed too much smoke in a closed space, whose lungs were full of the acrid residue of wet wood and poor ventilation. "How long has he been coughing like this?" she asked. Josiah's wife answered, her voice trembling. 3 days. We had to burn wet wood. The smoke, it filled the cabin. We opened the door to let it out, but then the cold came in and she could not finish. She did not need to. Elspeth understood immediately. They had been trapped between two deaths, freeze from the cold or suffocate from the smoke. The wet wood that was supposed to save them had been slowly poisoning them instead. The child needed clean air, warm, clean, dry air. The tunnel could provide that. The air inside was cold but pure, filtered through the canvas, free of smoke and moisture. If they could warm him gradually while letting him breathe clean air. But she hesitated. This was the man who had tried to take her home. This was the man who had wanted to send her to an orphanage so his friend could buy her land. This was the man who had called her grandfather's wisdom foolishness, who had said she was building her own grave. Behind her, Tad spoke quietly. Bestafar would have opened the door. He always said kindness is not for those who deserve it. It's what defines who you are. Elspeth looked at her brother, looked at the child in Josiah's arms, gasping for breath, his tiny body racked with coughs, looked at the family huddled together in the snow, waiting to see if the orphan girl they had mocked would save them or let them die. She stepped aside. "Come in. If you were Elspeth, would you have opened that door? Tell me in the comments. And whatever you do, do not leave, because the most important part of this story is still to come." They came in waves after that. Word spread somehow. Even in the blinding storm, even with the wind howling and the snow falling, and death waiting for anyone foolish enough to venture outside, word spread. The Whitmore cabin was warm. The Whitmore tunnel worked. The Whitmore orphans were saving people. The 8th day brought Dr. Holloway and his wife. The doctor was badly frostbitten, his fingers swollen and black at the tips, his face waxy with the early stages of hypothermia. He had tried to reach the cabin 3 times before finally making it on the 4th attempt, and when he stepped inside and felt the warmth hit him, he broke down weeping. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I said it was structurally impractical. I said it would never work. I was wrong." Elspeth handed him a blanket and a cup of hot water. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. The 9th day brought the Tanner family. Rufus Tanner, the young man who had bet $10 that the tunnel would collapse by Christmas, carried his mother on his back through chest-deep snow for nearly 2 miles. She was unconscious when they arrived, her breathing shallow, her heartbeat barely perceptible. It took 4 hours of careful warming before she opened her eyes and asked where she was. "You're safe," Elspeth told her. "You're in the cabin on the ridge." "The mad orphan's cabin, so?" "Yes." The old woman reached out and took Elspeth's hand in her own. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, child." On the morning of the 10th day, Tad was walking through the tunnel to fetch wood when he heard something outside the canvas wall. It was a soft sound, a scratching, like an animal trying to get in. He pulled back the entrance flap and looked out into the white world. At first he saw nothing. The snow was blinding, the wind still howling. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw a shape in the snow. A dark shape moving slowly, painfully, crawling toward the tunnel entrance on hands and knees. "Elsie!" he screamed. "Someone's out there!" They pulled her inside together, this woman who was more ice than flesh, whose fingers were black and whose lips were blue and whose eyes were barely open. She was ancient, perhaps 70 years old, and she was wearing nothing but a nightgown and a shawl. It was Martha Hendricks, the widow who lived alone in the cabin half a mile down the ridge. She had been crawling through the snow for 2 days. 2 days, in a nightgown, through 4 feet of snow and 40 below temperatures, inch by inch, foot by foot, dragging herself toward the only warmth she could think of. When they got her inside, when they wrapped her in blankets and held warm water to her lips, she opened her eyes and looked at Elspeth. "I laughed at you," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, a thread of sound that seemed to cost her everything she had left. "When you built your tunnel, I stood on my porch and I laughed. I said Magnus Whitmore's grandchildren had gone mad with grief." Elspeth said nothing. "I crawled here to die," Martha continued. "My cabin is gone. The roof collapsed under the snow. I thought, if I had to die, I wanted to die warm. I wanted to die in the place that proved me wrong." She closed her eyes. "Please, let me stay. Let me die here where your grandfather's wisdom built something beautiful." Martha Hendricks did not die. She lost 3 fingers to frostbite, and she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life from the damage the cold had done to her feet. But she did not die. And for the next 40 years, until her death at the age of 112, she would tell everyone she met the story of the tunnel that saved her life. "I crawled through hell to reach heaven," she would say, and heaven was a canvas tunnel built by 2 orphan children. Martha crawled through the snow for 2 days just to die in warmth. Have you ever met someone whose stubbornness saved their life? Share your story in the comments. The 10th day brought Cordelia Ashford and her 3 children. Her husband was not with them. He had gone out to check on the livestock the previous morning, she said. He had never come back. She had waited as long as she could, watching through the window, calling his name into the wind. Finally, she had bundled up the children and gone looking for him. She had found his body at sunset, frozen solid against the barn door, his hands still reaching for the latch. He had been so close to shelter, so close to warmth, and the cold had taken him anyway. She did not cry when she told this story. She simply stood in the middle of the crowded cabin, her children pressed against her sides, and stated the facts in a voice that held no emotion at all. Elspeth recognized that voice. It was the voice of someone who had gone past grief into something else entirely, something cold and numb and distant. The voice of someone who would not feel the full weight of her loss until much later, when the crisis was over and there was time for such things. She gave Cordelia her own bed and sat up through the night, watching the woman's children sleep. The 11th day brought Reverend Silas Thornton. The minister who had warned the children about pagan witchcraft limped through the tunnel with 6 of his parishioners following behind him. His church had become a refuge during the first days of the storm, but the building was not designed for heating, and the fire had gone out on the 8th day when they ran out of anything left to burn. They had survived by huddling together for warmth, sharing body heat, praying for deliverance. But 3 of his flock had not survived. He had buried them in the snow behind the church and led the rest to the only place he knew might still be warm. When he stepped into the cabin and saw the fire burning bright, when he felt the heat wrap around him like the arms of God, he fell to his knees and prayed. "Forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. "I called this place heathen. I called this wisdom ungodly. I was wrong. The Lord works through those who remember the old ways. The Lord works through children who have the courage to build what their grandfather dreamed." Elspeth let him pray. She had no anger left for him. She had no anger left for any of them. She was too tired for anger, too busy keeping everyone alive. By the 12th day, there were 23 people in the Whitmore cabin. 23 people in a space designed for 3. They slept in shifts, some on the floor, some sitting up against the walls, some curled together under shared blankets. They shared food, rationing the supplies that Elspeth had stored for the winter, stretching them as far as they would go. They took turns walking through the tunnel to fetch wood because the fire had to be fed constantly, had to be kept burning hot enough to warm all those bodies and dry all those clothes. Little Emmett Blackwood, the 4-year-old who had arrived coughing and gasping, spent hours in the tunnel itself, breathing the clean air. Slowly, day by day, his cough subsided. The color returned to his cheeks. He started to smile again, then to laugh, then to play with Odin, who tolerated the child's attention with the patience of an old boy who has seen many things. One night, when everyone else was asleep, Emmett tugged on Elspeth's sleeve. "Can I pet the dog?" he asked. It was the first full sentence he had spoken since arriving, the first sign that the smoke had not permanently damaged his lungs, that he was going to be all right. Elspeth lifted him onto the bed next to Odin, and the old dog pressed close to the boy, letting the child wrap small arms around his gray neck. They fell asleep like that, the boy and the dog, while Elspeth watched over them both. The 13th day, the storm finally began to weaken. The 14th day, the sky cleared. And on the 15th day, the survivors of Elk Ridge stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow lay 4 feet deep across the valley. Drifts piled 15, 20, 25 feet high against every building that had been in the wind's path. The sky was a brilliant blue, the kind of blue that only comes after a great storm, and the sun turned the snow into a blinding field of white that hurt to look at. Elspeth stood on her porch and surveyed the damage. The tunnel had held. It was battered and torn in places, some of the canvas ripped by the wind, some of the poles bent by the weight of drifted snow, but it had held. The structure that everyone had said was impractical, that everyone had said would collapse in the first real storm, had survived the worst blizzard in living memory. Around her, the 23 survivors emerged blinking into the light. Some of them were crying, some of them were laughing. Most of them simply stood in stunned silence, unable to believe that they were still alive, that the nightmare was finally over. Josiah Blackwood is the first to speak. He walked to the edge of the porch and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered valley, at the blue sky, at the smoke rising from the chimney of the cabin that had saved his family's lives. Then he turned to face Elspeth. He was not the same man who had ridden up to her property 4 months ago. His face was thinner, older, marked by frostbite scars that would never fully heal. His eyes held something that had not been there before, something that looked like humility, like shame, like the knowledge that he had been terribly, terribly wrong. "I called you orphan fools," he said. His voice was rough, hoarse from days of breathing smoke-filled air, but every word was clear. "I said you were building your own graves. I laughed at you. I tried to take you from your home and send you to an orphanage." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. Your grandfather's tunnels saved my grandson's life. It saved all of our lives. I don't have words for what I owe you." Elspeth looked at him for a long moment. She could have gloated. She could have reminded him of every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every bet placed against her. She could have turned him away and told him that he had made his bed and now he had to lie in it. But that was not who she was. That was not who her grandfather had raised her to be. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally. "My grandfather built that tunnel. I just followed his instructions." "Your grandfather drew a picture." Josiah shook his head slowly. "You built it. You built it while everyone laughed at you. You built it while everyone said you were crazy. You built it because you trusted him even when no one else did. That kind of faith is worth more than anything I've ever owned in my life." Dr. Holloway stepped forward. His hands were bandaged, 2 fingers lost to frostbite, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "The thermal buffer principle," he said. "I studied it while we were inside, waiting out the storm. The tunnel creates a microclimate, a transition zone where the temperature differential prevents the formation of ice on the stored wood. It's scientifically elegant. It's exactly what you said it would be." He met Elspeth's eyes. "I was wrong to dismiss it. I was wrong about a great many things." One by one, the others spoke. Rufus Tanner, who had bet against the tunnel, handed $10 to Ephraim Morrison, who had been the only one in town to bet that it would stand. "I've never been happier to lose a bet in my life," Rufus said. And for once, there was no mockery in his voice, no swagger in his posture. He looked like a man who had been humbled, truly humbled, for the first time in his life. Reverend Thornton offered a prayer of thanksgiving, and this time when he mentioned the wisdom of the Lord, he added, "And the wisdom of those who remember the old ways, and the wisdom of the children who had the faith to build what their elders could not understand." Cordelia Ashford said nothing. She simply walked over to Elspeth, took the girl's hands in her own, and held them for a long moment. Her husband was dead. Her life would never be the same. But her children were alive, and that was because of the tunnel, and no words could ever express what that meant. Franklin Briggs stood apart from the others, his face unreadable. He had lost everything in the storm. Every one of his cattle, his barn, his dreams of buying the Whitmore land for its spring. He watched the others thank Elspeth, and something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been shame or might have been something harder to name. He did not speak. He simply nodded once and turned away. It was enough. The weeks that followed were filled with work. The people of Elk Ridge dug out their homes, buried their dead, and tried to piece their lives back together. The storm had killed 67 people across 4 counties, along with thousands of cattle and horses. It was a disaster that would be remembered for generations. But in Elk Ridge, only 4 people had died. The lowest death toll in the region, because 23 people had survived in a cabin on Blackwater Ridge, kept warm by wood that stayed dry because of a canvas tunnel built by 2 orphan children. The story spread. It spread to the neighboring towns, then to the territorial newspapers, then to the rest of Montana. People came to see the tunnel, to study it, to understand how it worked. Engineers and architects made the journey to Blackwater Ridge, and they left with pages of notes and a new respect for traditional knowledge. In the first week of spring, when the snow began to melt and the world slowly returned to color, Elspeth decided to repair the loose floorboard in her grandfather's old room. It was the same floorboard where Tad had found the journal all those months ago, and it had been creaking all winter. She pried it up with a hammer, intending to nail it down properly, and found something she had not expected. A letter. It was wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected the journal, tucked into a corner of the space beneath the floor where they had not thought to look. The paper was yellowed with age. The ink faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was unmistakably her grandfather's. She sat down on the floor and read it. My dear Elspeth and Thaddeus, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found my hiding place. I am writing this on the night before the storm that I know will take my life. Do not weep for me. I have lived a good life. I have seen 2 countries. I have loved 2 families. I have learned things that most men never learn, and I have tried to pass them on. The tunnel I have drawn in my journal is my gift to you. I learned it from the Sami people in the far north of Norway, and from my own father, who learned it from his father before him. It is knowledge that has kept my family alive for generations. I had hoped to build it myself, but tonight, looking at the sky, I know that I will not have time. The storm is coming too fast, and I am too old to work as quickly as I once did. So I will do what I can. I will go out tomorrow and try to bring in enough wood to keep you warm until the storm passes. And if I do not return, I trust that you will find this letter and the journal, and that you will build what I could not. You are stronger than you know, both of you. Elspeth, you have your mother's courage and your father's stubbornness. You will need both in the years ahead. Thaddeus, you have my love of learning and my eye for detail. Use them well. Together, you can do anything. Do not let the world tell you that you are too young, or too poor, or too alone. You have something that most people do not have. You have knowledge. And knowledge, properly applied, is worth more than all the gold in Montana. Build the tunnel. Trust the old ways. And when the skeptics laugh, remember what I always told you. Wisdom takes time to recognize, and fools take time to forget. I love you both. I am proud of you both. And I will be watching over you from wherever the old Norwegians go when they die. Your loving grandfather, Magnus Whitmore, P.S. Take care of Odin. He is a good dog, and he will need you as much as you need him. Elspeth read the letter 3 times. The first time, she could barely see the words through her tears. The second time, she read it aloud, her voice breaking on every sentence. The third time, she read it silently, holding the paper against her heart. He had known. Her grandfather had known he was going to die. He had written this letter the night before he went out into the storm, knowing he might not come back, knowing the blizzard might take him. And instead of staying inside, instead of saving himself, he had gone out anyway, because the fire was getting low, because his grandchildren needed wood, because he loved them more than he loved his own life. She walked outside, climbed the hill to her grandfather's grave, and read the letter to him one more time. We built it, Bestafar, she said, her voice steady now, strong. We built your tunnel, and it saved 23 lives. The wind stirred the new grass on the grave, and somewhere in the valley a bird began to sing. You were right about everything, the tunnel, the knowledge, the skeptics. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. And you were right about us. We were stronger than we knew. She stayed on the hill until sunset, watching the light change over the valley that her grandfather had loved, the valley that his wisdom had helped save. Then she went home and showed the letter to Tad. They framed it and hung it on the wall next to the journal, where it remained for the next 100 years. Magnus wrote that letter knowing he would die the next day. He chose to save his grandchildren instead of himself. Press the like button if you believe that love like that never truly dies. In the spring of 1887, Josiah Blackwood brought a crew of men to the Whitmore property, not to cause trouble, to help. I'm building a tunnel of my own, he told Elspeth. But first, I'm going to help you repair yours. It's the least I can do. By the end of that summer, 11 families in the valley had built their own tunnels. They called them Whitmore tunnels, and the name stuck. In 1890, the territorial government sent a representative to study the design. His report recommended that all frontier homesteads in areas of extreme cold consider implementing similar structures. He cited the Whitmore design as an elegant application of traditional Scandinavian building techniques to the unique challenges of the American frontier. That same year, Elspeth Whitmore became the first woman ever invited to serve on the Elk Ridge Town Council. She was 21 years old. Franklin Briggs, who had lost everything in the storm, quietly withdrew his interest in the Whitmore land. He never apologized in words, but he sent 2 young heifers to the cabin that spring, along with a note that said simply, "For the children who taught me that wisdom doesn't come from wealth." Martha Hendricks, who had crawled through the snow for 2 days, became Elspeth's closest friend. She visited the cabin every week for the rest of her life, and she always entered through the tunnel, no matter the weather. "It saved me once," she would say. "The least I can do is pay my respects." The years passed, as years do. Elspeth married Ephraim Morrison in 1892 in a small ceremony at the rebuilt church in Elk Ridge. Reverend Thornton officiated, and in his sermon he spoke about the wisdom of trusting in knowledge that has been passed down through generations, about the courage of young people who build things that their elders do not understand. Josiah Blackwood was there, his grandson Emmett standing beside him. Emmett was 9 years old now, healthy and strong, with no lasting damage from the smoke that had nearly killed him. He had grown up hearing the story of the tunnel, and he would grow up to tell it to his own children and grandchildren. Tad never married. He was not built for romance, he said, but he was built for knowledge. He spent his life collecting and preserving the techniques that his grandfather had passed down, adding to them, improving them, sharing them with anyone who wanted to learn. In 1920, he published a book called The Tunnel That Saved Elk Ridge, Traditional Wisdom for Modern Winters. It sold modestly but steadily, and it was still in print 50 years later. Odin died in the spring of 1889. He was 11 years old, ancient for a border collie, and he went peacefully in his sleep by the fire that he had loved so much. Elspeth and Tad buried him on the hill next to their grandfather's grave, and they carved a stone that read, "Odin Whitmore. He waited for us at the tunnel every day." For years afterward, visitors to the Whitmore property would find flowers on that stone, left by the children of Elk Ridge who had grown up hearing stories of the brave old dog who had guarded the orphans through the worst winter in memory. In 1952, Elspeth Whitmore Morrison died in her sleep at the age of 83. She died in the cabin on Blackwater Ridge, the same cabin where she had been born, the same cabin where she had built her grandfather's tunnel, the same cabin where she had saved 23 lives. This tunnel was still there, rebuilt several times over the decades, but always faithful to the original design. Her grandchildren had learned to use it, and her great-grandchildren were learning now. Tad was 80 years old when his sister died. He stood at her grave on the hill, next to their grandfather Magnus and their dog Odin, surrounded by 4 generations of family. His own children were there, gray-haired now themselves. His grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, some of them too young to understand why everyone was crying. He looked at them, at all of them, and he thought about the 17-year-old girl who had pulled ropes tight while the whole world laughed at her, The girl who had opened her door to the man who called her a fool. The girl who had saved 23 lives with nothing but a canvas tunnel and their grandfather's journal and her own stubborn, unshakable faith. Your great-great-grandmother and I built that tunnel when we were just children, he said, his voice thin with age but steady with purpose. Everyone laughed. They called us orphan fools. They bet money that our work would fail. He paused, looking at the faces of the youngest children, who were watching him with wistful, curious eyes. But best of all, our grandfather knew something they didn't know. He wrote it in a letter that we found after the storm, hidden under the floor where he knew we would eventually look. Tad reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper, yellowed and fragile, protected now by a frame of glass. The same letter that had hung on the cabin wall for 65 years. He wrote, "The biggest killer in winter isn't the cold you can see, it's the moisture you can't. And the biggest wisdom isn't from books or schools or experts. It's from those who came before us, who learned through living, who passed their knowledge down so that we might survive." He put the letter away and looked at the grave. Elsie never forgot that, and neither should you. A great-grandson, perhaps 7 years old, tugged at his sleeve. "Great-grandpa Tad, is the tunnel still there?" Tad smiled, and for a moment, he looked like the 14-year-old boy who had read his grandfather's journal by candlelight, who had believed in something that no one else could see. "It's still there. 66 years, and it's still standing. Your great-great-grandmother rebuilt it twice, but she never changed the design, because Bestafar got it right the first time." He took the boy's hand. "Would you like to see it?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Tad Whitmore, 80 years old, walked down the hill with his great-grandson toward the canvas tunnel that everyone had laughed at. The tunnel that had saved 23 lives, the tunnel that stood as proof that sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who truly understands what's coming. In 1978, a team of researchers from Montana State University traveled to Blackwater Ridge to study the original Whitmore tunnel design. The structure had been maintained continuously for 92 years, rebuilt and repaired, but never fundamentally changed. The researchers measured its dimensions, analyzed its materials, and tested its performance against modern construction standards. Their findings were remarkable. The tunnel's thermal buffer effect was 2.4 times more efficient at preventing wood moisture accumulation than conventional covered storage. The curved design distributed wind loads more effectively than flat or angled structures. The canvas, properly treated and maintained, could last for decades with minimal care. The lead researcher, a professor of architectural engineering, included a note in his final report. The Whitmore Tunnel represents a perfect marriage of traditional knowledge and practical innovation. Its designer, Magnus Whitmore, drew on centuries of Scandinavian building techniques and adapted them to the unique challenges of the Montana frontier. The tunnel's continued effectiveness after nearly a century of use is a testament to the enduring value of wisdom passed down through generations. In an age of high-tech solutions and computer-modeled designs, there is something humbling about a structure that works simply because someone's grandfather knew what he was doing. Today, if you visit the Blackwater Ridge historical site in Montana, you can see a reconstruction of the original Whitmore Tunnel. It stands exactly where Elspeth and Tad built it, stretching from the preserved cabin to the woodshed, a canvas passage frozen in time. Visitors come from across the country to walk through it, to feel the stillness of the air inside, to understand how two orphan children saved 23 lives with nothing but their grandfather's journal and their own stubborn faith. The cabin is a museum now. Inside, you can see the original journal, open to page 47, where Magnus Whitmore drew his transition passage and wrote his explanation of thermal buffers. You can see the letter he wrote the night before he died, framed and mounted on the wall. You can see the tools that Elspeth and Tad used to build the tunnel, worn smooth by their young hands. And if you look carefully, in a corner by the fireplace, you can see a small stone marker that was moved inside when the cabin became a museum. Odin Whitmore. He waited for us at the tunnel every day. The descendants of those 23 survivors still live in the area. Every January 10th, on the anniversary of the Great Blizzard, they gather at the historical site for a ceremony. They tell the story of the mad orphans in their canvas tunnel. They remember the names of those who died and those who lived, and they repeat the words that Tad spoke at his sister's funeral. Words that have become a kind of local proverb, passed down through generations just like the knowledge that saved them all. The biggest killer isn't the cold you can see, it's the moisture you can't. And the biggest wisdom isn't from books, it's from those who came before us. So the next time you see someone building something that makes no sense to you, something that everyone else is laughing at, something that seems foolish and impractical and strange, remember this story. Remember Elspeth Whitmore, 17 years old, pulling ropes tight while her neighbors mocked her. Remember Tad Whitmore, 14 years old, reading his grandfather's journal by candlelight while the whole town bet against him. Remember Magnus Whitmore, who died 30 feet from his own front door and left behind the knowledge that would save his grandchildren's lives. Remember Odin, the old gray dog who waited at the tunnel every morning. Remember that wisdom takes time to recognize, and fools take time to forget. And remember that sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who truly understands what's coming. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you know someone who has ever been laughed at for doing things differently, someone who trusted in knowledge that others dismissed, send this to them, because they might just be building their tunnel, while everyone else is still stacking wood in the rain.
The biggest killer isn't the cold you see, it's the moisture you don't. Elspeth and Tad were called mad orphans for building a canvas tunnel while the town laughed. But when the 1887 blizzard struck, their madness saved 23 lives. True wisdom often looks like folly to those who don't understand what's coming. Trust your instincts. Honor the old ways. And if they laugh at you, let them. Keep building your tunnel, because when the storm breaks, the only thing that matters is who survives.